Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Cybersecurity series with me, Chirag Joshi. Now, a big part of why we did this series is to cover all the different multifaceted aspects around cybersecurity, not just the technical ones. And a key part of that also is legal. And I am very, very fortunate in my career that I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of legal professionals and make good friends with them and understand the strong relationship and the need for a strong relationship between cyber professionals and legal professionals to achieve outcomes. uh, but with that, I think the world, as quickly as it changes, that importance only gotten bigger and even more prominent in why we need that relationship. So I wanted to discuss that aspect, which is why we're titling this episode Art of Legal in Cybersecurity. And to join me in this conversation, I'm so delighted that I've actually had one of the premier professionals in Australia to speak to me about this topic, about this niche topic, legal in cyber. And it's Annie Haggar. So Annie has a long and distinguished career in legal and also focusing on cybersecurity, which includes consulting. She's done that across multiple countries in her role, and now she's also just recently launched her own firm. So congratulations to Annie. But with that, I'd formally bring Annie on. Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Chirag. It's really great to be on.
No, thank you for the time you've taken. So, Annie, I gave a very high level view of what you've done, but I also know that you won a General Counsel Award. So, congratulations. These are big achievements, especially when you think about how many professionals there are for someone to be respected by their peers in industry. It's a big testament to all the work you do. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
So,
I was very lucky to have a few awards that year, but it really was a recognition of the support from my team and from the Accenture security business who I was supporting as their legal counsel at the time.
yeah, no, that's awesome. So look, Annie, I just gave a very, quick snippet about you, but would you like to just give the audience a little bit more about yourself and your journey so far, and then we can get into some of the discussion areas?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I have been a legal professional for getting on for 20 years now, and I've spent my entire career, even before I was qualified, in working in and around technology law. And it was seemed a natural progression to pivot and focus on cybersecurity when that started to become an emerging area. Now, of course, it's been an emerging area for as long as we've had the internet, but from a legal perspective, it's really become a focus in the last 7 to 10 years. And I was working for one of the biggest consulting firms in the world, Accenture, in their legal team. And I had the opportunity to help set up Accenture Security as a business from the legal perspective, working with a couple of other lawyers around the world. And that gave me a really unique perspective because whilst it was a startup within a global company, we got to see how do we deliver these services to our clients in regulatory environments in 134 countries around the world, spanning cybersecurity services end to end, not just managed security, not just consulting, but all of the cyber defense, threat intelligence, threat hunting type services as well, the ones that can get you locked up if you're a security professional. So we were really able to dive into some fascinating areas from how to get these services out to our clients and protect our company. But in that journey, it also gave me the opportunity to really see how companies were struggling with cybersecurity from a legal and technical perspective and see how I could probably help them to navigate that journey. And that led me to start my own cybersecurity specialist law firm only a few weeks ago, but drawing on that almost decade's experience in cybersecurity.
Oh, that's great, Annie. So, well, I think that's a great segue into the first discussion area, right? Like the role of legal in cybersecurity, to your point, has always been there, and I think it's become even more prominent. But I want to ask you, like, how do you view the role of legal in the current days and times which we live in, where cybersecurity has become so much more prominent and in the headlines than it ever was?
It's, I think, an evolving thing. So traditionally, lawyers wouldn't have thought that they had a role to play in IT and security. That's the IT team, that's to do with technical things. But actually, as the regulatory environment changes, and I know we're going to talk a lot about the regulatory situation later on, but as that changes and as that has different impacts for the businesses and for the people impacted by cybersecurity, means that a legal team has to go from being on the periphery of security to at the very heart of it. And if you are in-house legal to a company or business, and if you're their external legal advisor, you really need to be thinking about how you are preparing your client or your company for the cybersecurity risk that's facing them, because it's not just about have the IT team got things lined up. It's actually about how are you helping to assess the cybersecurity risk? How are you helping to plan for your company's response to it? How are you helping to prepare your legal team? And that means that you've got to perhaps shift your focus. In-house lawyers tend to be experts in general company things, and also the area of law that their business needs them to be an expert in. So if you've got a property business, then your lawyers are likely to be property lawyers with expertise in corporate governance, etc., but they're not likely to be technology lawyers. They might be employment specialists, but they won't necessarily have the skill sets to get right into the detail of the cybersecurity space, which is why I started the firm, and why I'm also really encouraging all lawyers to get in touch with their technical teams to start upskilling and to really start to be aware of these issues so that they can tackle them.
Yeah, no, it's really good points around the specialization that is expected and the role that lawyers need to play in this, because you're right. Like for the longest time, I remember, the engagement used to be around contracts and around clauses, which were important. You had e-discovery in the mix as well, because that was a place where there was a lot of intersection. But yeah, we're dealing with entirely new frontiers in terms of, the technology landscapes shifted tremendously. We talked about regulations. We'll talk about regulations in a lot more detail, because Australia has just had a flurry of them when it comes to cybersecurity. But before I get to regulations, there's one area which I'm keen to cover is, as a cyber professional, I always like to ask this question of experts like yourself is, how can we engage more effectively with you? Because I think it's two ways. I think a lot of folks in cyber still think of engaging legal like, oh, just do a contract review. They don't really get the most value out of the legal expertise that can come in. So I'm keen to understand, how can cyber folks engage better with legal?
It's a really great question. I think the first thing is, don't be scared of legal. We're just humans, and we might be lawyers. So that might make us use some technical legal terms and things, but ultimately we are really good at assessing and helping to manage risk. And so if you can come to your legal team and say, hey guys, I think that our biggest risk to our company is here in this cybersecurity space, and I'd like to sit down with you and work out how we can work together to solve this problem. Your lawyers aren't going to turn you away. They are busy individuals, but if you flag to them the significance of this risk and really tell them the story about all of the ways that you as a security professional see the company at risk, you can help to bring them to the table. And some of the things that you could point out to them that they might want to look at, starting with customer terms. What are the terms you're putting in front of your customers, and how are they protecting your business from the consequences of a cyber breach, be that liability to the extent that you can limit it? Do you have the impact of cybersecurity events covered from excusable delay or force majeure, using lots of legal terms, but the lawyers will understand what they mean. And do you have the right to get some of the services that you will need in the cybersecurity space performed? So do your customer terms allow the red teaming or hunting or other security scanning that you should be doing as a business to occur over their data? Have you got the right permissions? So that's just customer terms. We can have a look at insurance. Ask the lawyers to sit with you and look at the insurance that you've got in the cyberspace, if you have any, and to make sure that that cover covers the things that you need, but also to make sure that everybody understands the conditions for calling on it. You don't want to have a cyber event, have your incident response team come in, then look at the insurance and discover that actually to claim under it, you had to use this entirely different incident response team. And now, because you didn't use them, your cyber insurance is unavailable. And your lawyers can help you look through those terms and make sure that that's in place. Supply chain contracts, another really big one. Say to your lawyers, can we sit down with our supplier contracts and understand, triage them, work out which are the critical suppliers and start there, but work out, do they have to meet specific security standards? And do they have to tell you if they've had a breach and within what time frame? does that allow you to meet your regulatory reporting obligations? And it's all very well if they have to meet a certain standard, but how can you check on that? And if they haven't, what can you do to enforce that under the contract? So all things that lawyers will go, oh, we can fix that in the supply chain contract, or they can get help from security experts to help with that. Another area to look at is employment policies. If you've got an employee who's constantly laissez-faire about their security and clicking on malicious links, they are the biggest exposure to your organization from a security point of view. So what can you do with them? Can you discipline them? Can you, if they continue to pose that level of risk to your business, can you fire them? And having a look at that employment situation is really important. And then my favorite one at the moment, incident response. Is the legal team in your incident response plan? Because it's not. If they're not, they should be. They should be the first person that you call. And do they understand the role that they need to play in that incident response plan? So sit down with them, make sure that they're included in your tabletop exercises or your wargaming around incidents, because you don't want the first time for them considering all these issues to be when you've got a live breach. You want them to be part of your team. So include them as much as you can. And I would like to say, I guarantee you that they will listen. But if they feel like they don't know how to come at this is when you might suggest to them that they get some expertise in this area or get some help, because no lawyer can be an expert in everything. And this is such an important area that they need to make sure that they have got the right skill sets and the right support.
Wow, so many, like, look, the focus of this whole series has been, to me, Annie, about actionable takeaways, and you kind of just rattled off so many of them right there, all invaluable in their own right, and such great points. You touched upon, like, even cyber insurance, which is such a hot button issue right now. People do need to understand what coverage they have, when that kicks in, under what circumstances, and the premiums have gone up significantly, as we know. So it's a topic that merits a discussion all in its own right. So we probably should think about that as well. That's a great topic. But we touched upon regulations as well in your discussion, and I think it's regulations, to me, are a double-edged sword. Like, I think they do serve a really good purpose when done right. They can set the tone. They bring industries up to a level which is commensurate to what's expected. So I think they definitely have a role to play. But I want to get your thoughts on the current regulatory landscape in Australia, especially related to cyber and privacy. So some of the recent changes, for example, to the Privacy Act, the amendment there, which increased the maximum penalties. Also the SOCI Act, the Security of Critical Infrastructure, where you started to see a lot of changes coming down now. And for some assets, there are enhanced obligations. So we'll probably kick off with your thoughts on just regulatory landscape in general, and then perhaps if you want to tackle either of these specifically.
Sure. I think about the regulatory environment as a continuum, and it's a progression of maturity for countries as we tackle cybersecurity. And one of the interesting things about my old role was looking across so many different countries and their regulations and seeing that regulatory development. And it really starts in the early days with governments thinking we need to do something to ensure that our systems and our population are protected and our economy is protected. So what do we want to do? And they look at it from okay, how can we encourage people to take the right actions? And they look at, well, what are the sticks? So we talk about carrots and sticks in terms of regulation. What's the encouragement and benefit with complying, but also what's the penalty if you don't? And I've seen countries, including Australia, go through minimum standards, processes around licensing providers. So providers of cybersecurity services that have to be qualified, registered, licensed, etc. I've seen them go through stages of requiring reporting, that reporting coming in at different thresholds, and that reporting being thresholds for the size of the organisation or the size of the breach and records impacted or the size of the ransom. And then we look at the penalties, what are the penalties for non-compliance? And that can be fines, it can be impacts on your right to operate if you're in a licensed regulated industry. And I've actually seen a country recently bring in criminal charges against the IT team who failed to implement patches on a system that then led to a breach. So this continuum is really interesting. And Australia is in the middle of that consideration of that policy setting at the moment. And we have come from the reporting of privacy to now it's a reporting of breaches and the impact on personal information. We're now got the SOCI, Nuclear Systems of National Significance regulation, providing minimum standards to be met for businesses that run a system of national significance and consequences for them if they don't. We've also got the ASIC case that was handed down last week by the federal court for GetSwift, which they followed very quickly by saying there were going to be significant penalties in the future for failure to disclose to ASIC breaches. So you see the regulators, not just the government, but the regulators bringing in these rules, and they are coming on that continuum and getting more sophisticated, but they're then tackling different areas. And what's been really interesting for me to watch is how they are moving into that space, because it's around the social license to regulate in this space. Governments can only bring in legislation where they feel that the population is going to accept it. And they can push that a little, but they are limited by that social license for the population. And we have this interesting position in Australia at the moment where the population wants its data protected and they want to feel that they have a right to privacy. And they don't want the government to be able to access that information. They certainly don't want other people to be able to access it either, but government's quite low on the trust threshold there. And attacks on our government systems don't help to build that trust. But they also have this expectation that the government would step in and help to defend a business against a cyber attack to prevent their information from being stolen. So on the one hand, they don't want government to have a right to access their information. But on the other, they want the government to step in to a business who's under attack and have access to that information and those systems and be entitled to take control. And that's a very difficult balance to strike in a regulation about where that social license is coming in. And I think coming to your point, Chirag, earlier about it's always a double-edged sword. Regulation has an impact and then it has an opposite impact as well, often to the one that it intended. So requiring reporting from entities that meet certain criteria, whether that's the size or their turnover or they're paying a ransom of a certain thing, actually, it enables the governments to track what's happening in the country in that space. But it also can mean that you get an adjustment in the attacks. So the ransomware attacks now set the ransom at a level slightly lower than the reportable threshold, just changes the business model. And it also drives a different incentive. Organisations that might have otherwise reported, now that they don't have to, because they're not above the required reporting threshold, hold that information back. And so you get perhaps a negative reporting behaviour, which is an unintended consequence. Another example in the licensing space is if you require security providers to be licensed, you get the comfort that only qualified, sophisticated providers are going to be helping your community, your population defend. But it provides a real barrier to entry. And that might discourage people from getting into that space, and it might discourage multinationals from setting up in your country. I don't think that's such an issue in Australia, but it certainly is an issue in parts of Asia, and in the Pacific and other more developing nations, where they are trying desperately to increase their ability to defend, but by having a licensing approach, which is what the approach their government has, it's actually discouraging providers from setting up business there. And in Australia, it provides another barrier to entry in terms of individuals. If individuals had to be licensed, etc., which they don't at the moment, if you were to take that approach, it makes it harder for us to fix that skills gap. So it's about considering that balance. I think there's one other point I was going to make about that, Chirag, which was there has to be balanced. The risk of regulating has to be balanced by the risk of not regulating. So if you regulate, you're requiring businesses to meet a minimum set of criteria, and there's a cost with that. And that cost has to be balanced with the cost of living, the interest rates, the taxes, and the availability of resources, which is what we're really struggling with at the moment in Australia, right? Do we have enough security professionals to help all the businesses that need to implement the minimum 8 to actually do it? Well, no, not at the moment. But the problem with not regulating is that it actually impacts on the most vulnerable in our community, because if you allow organizations to not have a minimum standard, then the ones that fall below are the ones that can't afford and aren't required to meet standards, not for profits. And those not for profits are often supporting the most vulnerable in our community. They don't have the budgets to compete in the market for the expertise that's hard to get in the first place. And that means they become more vulnerable because their systems aren't supported. They can't meet the minimum standards. They can't afford the people to put it in place. And that means the services that they offer to the most vulnerable members of our community are also most at risk. So they are a soft target for attacks, but they are also the ones least able to prepare and defend.
Yeah. Hey, Annie, that last point is such a powerful point about, the risk of not regulating and the impact on vulnerable folks. I think it's, yeah, that's a really key consideration. Sometimes, when people get a bit overwhelmed with all the different regulations and, the cost of them, I think it's also important to reflect on why that is required. And we've seen evidence, and I think I'm just speaking from personal experience here, but seen when there is that mandate that comes in, you start to see a culture shift, which is usually a positive culture shift. I think the problem happens when you equate compliance with security, but that's a separate conversation. I think at least having that expectation now outlined will result in a culture change, which is really what you want in the first instance. So no, thanks for all your thoughts on that. It's a fascinating kind of perspective that you can provide, and which is why I love having these conversations, because you think of this from a very different vantage point than a cyber practitioner or a CISO would. So that's really good to hear. Hey, you in your response you also talked about ransomware, and I think ransomware is, as we know, a big problem, not just in Australia but globally, and it's only getting worse. And I think incentivized by the money people are making of it, and the ease by which sometimes they can deploy these tools and services, because you essentially have cybercrime as a service these days. So I did want to get your thoughts, right, on ransomware. It's a big topic area. But how do you view this subject from a perspective of a legal professional? And when you advise your clients or folks you work with, when they're firming up their ransomware position, what are the tips that you can provide there? Because from my understanding, and I'm no lawyer, but from my understanding, it's a legal gray area when it comes to paying ransom or not paying ransom. Ethically, we know it's not the right outcome, but legally, it's not as black and white. So keen to get your thoughts on the subject, and what advice you would give to people when they consider their ransom position.
It's a really interesting question around ethics because there isn't one size that fits all. And what you need to do and whether you're assessing whether to pay a ransom or not really depends on the business you're in, the type of attack, and what's actually happened. So, for example, if you have got a ransom situation where the threat actor has paralyzed your business systems and you can't operate, the impact to you and your business is reputational, but it's also mostly financial. You're losing money from not operating. It can also be a human element. If you're a hospital, there are people who can't have surgery, you can't operate, and that has a human toll as well. But that comes down to what is the kind of business you're running. Then there's the other type of attack, which is the data exfiltration and pay a ransom, otherwise we're going to release your data onto the dark web situation. And that involves an entirely different set of considerations, because what is the data that they've got? Is it data that's easily remedied if it's released? And easy being a relative term, is it credit cards that can be replaced? Is it driver's licenses and things, which is really difficult, painful administratively to fix, but ultimately can be reissued? Or is it like the Medibank situation? It's people's personal health information that once released can never be fixed. And that all plays into that ethical decision making. So when you're thinking as a business about that incident response planning, particularly in the case of whether to pay ransom or not, I think you do need to think, what kind of a business are we running? And let's work through scenarios about what's happened. Is it a data exfiltration, or is it a encryption and lock of your business? And what impact is that happening? And what if it happened to this part of the business, but not this other part? What is the minimum thing that we need to keep running? And then that can lead to some useful questions around how we're protecting that, and are we protecting the right things? there's another view about, should we pay, should we not pay? And there is a legal grey area there, but ultimately, I actually don't see it as that grey. Most of, ultimately the ransom is being paid to cyber criminals. You're paying a criminal. And that is aiding and abetting that criminal in their activities. And that, in many countries, that's very clearly illegal. It's not quite so clear in Australia at the moment. But also a lot of the ransomware criminal groups that are running these operations are already on the sanctioned list of entities that it is illegal to fund those organizations and to pay them. And also, or they are located in locations where it's illegal, thanks to sanctions and other laws, to pay them. So that becomes very clear. It is illegal to pay this group or to pay an entity that we suspect is in this country. Now, you might not have that information, depending on how sophisticated the attack is. You might be negotiating the ransom, but not actually knowing really who it is. And that is where the grey area is. And that you don't know who you're paying, you don't know where they are, and you don't know the flow-on consequences for paying money to those entities. And there is that view about should we make paying ransoms illegal? And some hold the view that, look, yes, you should say generally, yes, paying a ransom should be illegal, regardless of who it's to. And but that there should be an exception, which is a safe harbour. So that if, for example, you're a hospital and the ethical decision-making tree that you follow in that initial assessment says the consequences of harm of not paying the ransom and unlocking this system immediately is that X number of people will die, and that just means we're going to have to pay the ransom, regardless of who it's to. But that should provide a safe harbour for the directors and executives and the companies making that decision from legal prosecution. And it wouldn't apply to everyone, and it wouldn't apply to all ransomware demands, but it would give people that safe harbour space if they met some criteria. There is a problem with that, though, is that it continues to make us a target. And if we had a decision as a community that we are just going to make all ransoms illegal, it would turn off the tap for this business model for cyber criminals, and they will take their business elsewhere to somewhere that is an easier target. It might take some time, and we will have some fallout from that, and it would be not dissimilar to what we experienced with Medibank, where people's very sensitive information is released and there are irreparable consequences from that. But if we held together as a community and said, we're just not going to pay ransoms, it wouldn't take too long before the targets shifted to some other unfortunate country, or the cyber criminals would adjust their business model. Now, that doesn't stop espionage. It doesn't stop people who are just after disrupting rather than who are motivated by money, but it will make that ransomware threat reduce or shift entirely. And I think that is a policy decision that the government needs to think about, whether we do provide that safe harbour or not. Where do we want to sit as a community on this issue? Because whatever we do, we have to do it together.
Oh, well said. I mean, it's just listening to you, right? I mean, I think when ethically, it's a gray area. That what I hear you speak, it's like, what are the ethics around it? To your point, it's it's such a difficult topic. And what I have suggested and what I have recommended and what I work with is, just have a position or a defined organizational policy regarding ransomware. And it should cover, to your point, all of these factors that come into play. Who you should contact, under what circumstances would you even consider. And I think it's all, and general counsel, to your point, needs to be in the room when these discussions happen. So when you brought that up earlier, I completely agree. When people do these tabletop exercises and gamification with executives, and if legal's not at the table, that's an incomplete exercise as far as I'm concerned when it comes to cybersecurity incidents, because there is so much you're losing out on. And to your point, if there is a lack of capability in house, like, sure, I think you can have expertise in the marketplace that you can leverage. So really good stuff, Danny. Look, I want to move to a different area now in the conversation, and this is an area where I am really interested to know what makes people them, and it's what feeds their growth mindset. because I don't think anybody reaches to your level of expertise without having to go through rigorous training, not just one time degree and done. It's like an ongoing growth journey, especially in the areas that you deal in, law and cyber. How do you keep your growth mindset going, and what can you share in terms of tips to other people?
I think I'm lucky that I'm naturally quite curious, and I get a real buzz when I'm learning something new. And this means when I'm not at work, I'm usually occupying myself with some new craft skill. I'm learning a new embroidery technique or quilting or knitting or some other crazy project, or working in the garden. I recently decided I was going to become a beekeeper and did a beekeeping course, because it's about loving learning and learning that new area. And I find it fills me with energy. And I know for some people, the sense of learning new things makes them tired. But I'm lucky that for me, naturally, learning fills me with energy and enthusiasm. And I think that's been really key in my career choices in going into technology law and in pivoting into cyber, because the fun thing about being a lawyer in these spaces is that there is an endless amount to learn, and it is constantly changing and growing. What is the latest cybersecurity threat? What's the latest emerging technology? It's never going to finish. And so for somebody who loves change, it's really energizing. And there is a flip side to that you can feel exhausted by the fact that you'll never actually catch up. But if you see that as a fun challenge, then I think it can help you to feel that enthusiasm and want to continue to learn. But I think it's also that you need to have support from your organizations, your employer, and other places where you might spend your time to explore new areas and grow your skill set. And I was at Accenture for almost 12 years, and what I loved from them as an employer was that they always gave their people space to innovate and to take risks and try new things. And I know a lot of businesses these days are giving people paid time to go and do that innovation and growth and to find their passion and to work on those non-core projects, because who knows, it could be the next big thing. And I know that Google's got a global policy about allowing people to work on those projects, and actually they spin out into whole new businesses for them all the time. So it's about providing your employees with that space and encouragement to grow and learn, because that means that they're more engaged and invested and excited coming to work every day, because they get to have a say in that growth. And I think I've benefited from that in my own career, but it's also something that's going to be really at the core of my own firm now that I'm running one, is allowing people that space to grow and learn and innovate.
Yeah, that element of curiosity, to your point, is such a key skill, Annie. It's a desire to just learn new things and not, to your point, get tired by it, but energized by it. And I think it's in these times that we live in, especially, I feel change is always a constant, but it seems like change is on steroids these days. And with things like artificial intelligence and chat GPT became a household thing. I mean, if you're not keeping up, I'm not saying people need to be experts at everything, but if you're not keeping up and learning and just evolving, it's very easy for your skill set to be really outdated pretty quickly than it ever was. So yes, it's a big area. Hey, I know, Annie, you've been very generous with your time, so I'll just have one last question to close out. And this is an important one from my perspective, because it's for people who are looking to, or lawyers, or even cyber professionals, other professionals looking to get in the industry, who are looking to specialize in this space of legal advice and that relationship. What recommendations would you give them? Where do they start? How can they kind of take this journey forward?
I get asked this a lot, actually, and it's a question that I love, having come to cybersecurity, in the middle of my career. And I'll add also, I have a law degree, but my other degree is arts, and I did politics and international relations and literature. So I don't have a single coding bone in my body. And that hasn't stopped me, and it shouldn't stop anyone else from tackling a new area. And I get asked by both security professionals wanting to complement their skill sets with a law degree, and also the opposite, lawyers who want to become cybersecurity lawyers because they can see what an interesting area and an area of growth it is. And I was in a difficult position when I started doing security, because there were no university courses. There wasn't really any qualifications you could do, and I just had to learn on the job. which was a fantastic way of learning because I got to spend a lot of time with experts like yourself, really deep diving into the how did the services work, and okay, so you do this and then you do that, and then what happens and what are the potential consequences, and it was a really wonderful, involved way of learning. But I don't have any letters after my name or degrees in security because they weren't available at the time. That has changed. In the last 7 years, there have now become a proliferation of excellent legal based security qualifications that you can do. And I think that people in this space need to make some decisions about where they're interested, because there's this sort of whole piece around data and privacy that you can focus on. Then there's the systems of national significance, critical infrastructure space. Then you've got the national security space, and you can just do a whole degree specialising in the law around national security and international law, etc. And each of those has quite different careers that come with it in that security space. So you don't just become a security lawyer, you become a national security lawyer, etc. So I think my advice is think about what interests you in the area of cybersecurity. Look for a qualification that you can do the same time as working, because if you can find a graduate position or a junior position somewhere where you can learn legal skills and add your cybersecurity skills in, then that will accelerate your learning. If you're a lawyer and you want to be adding cybersecurity, see if you can come and work for a team who does that kind of work, understanding that you'll need to learn the technical security bits, but you can perhaps do some technical courses that complement your law, and you'll learn the legal elements as well along the way. So there's no one path, but I highly encourage it because we desperately need more security legal trained people. There's really only a couple of handfuls of us in the country and in the world. And I really struggled when I was hiring a team to work with me to find qualified people, and I trained a lot of them myself. So that is something I'll be doing in my own practice, is having a real focus on training more lawyers in cybersecurity, but I can't do it alone. So if anyone is thinking about it, please do consider it as a career move. It's extremely fulfilling. It's incredibly varied and interesting. And you can be part of growing this emerging area of the law, and there's something really exciting about the greenfields nature of that.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point in terms of, like, how it has evolved from it's essentially being an organic learning journey to there are some pathways now which are more formalized, which people can pursue. But yeah, it's there are lots of things to your just response there, which people can go in and figure out, what role do they see playing. And yeah, look, it's going to be even more important in my view. Like, and that's just how I feel. Like, the topic of cybersecurity and cyber risk is so prominent at the board level, and all my discussion with executives, it's related to cyber risk and cybersecurity. And I think legal's key part of that to me, and for me to interpret regulations that are coming in, their consequences, having those discussions, and somebody trusted who understands both those languages, I think is going to be an invaluable skill set. So Annie, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been an unbelievably invaluable conversation. It's been awesome. So many things I have learned just in this time that we spent together. I'm sure the audience will get a lot out of it too. And are you okay if the folks and our listeners reach out to you? I know you have your new website now, which they can go to. It's cybergc.au. So I encourage folks to check that out and connect with you on LinkedIn if you're okay with that.
Of course, I'd be delighted to hear from people who are interested in the space and just sharing their thoughts. And of course, if anyone wants some help, I'm here for that as well. But really, this is about discussion and growing awareness and working together as a security professional community to help make Australia the most secure place in the world. We've got a long way to go, but everyone pulls together. So please reach out and let's connect and keep the discussion going.
Well said. On that note, thank you very much. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. See you next time.